As many who have participated in our previous symposium know, we discuss a lot of issues dealing with the intersections, but through an interdisciplinary lens. And so often this includes filmmaking, films created by Native filmmakers, African-American filmmakers, and showcasing their talents as well as their expressions. And so today, I am proud to announce that we have two very influential and interesting filmmakers, researchers that are participating today. Heather Andolina and Gina Gayle-Faulkner. Gina Gayle-Faulkner, let me pull up your bio briefly. So she is a photographer, a writer, and filmmaker from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her latest work, Reckoning the Fight for Birth Justice, is a 4-part docuseries on racial bias in reproductive health. Heather Andolina serves as the president of the Melungeon Heritage Association, and she's the host of the podcast Melungeon Voices and the executive producer for Underbyte Films documentary, Infamous Characters, Notorious Villains, which sheds light on the history of the Melungeon people. So thank you both for joining me today. Really interested in this conversation in particular because these are two areas that I feel like aren't really discussed and that incorporate both groups very significantly in terms of Native and African-American populations. So thank you for joining me first.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so first I would like to start with each of you, if you could kind of give a rundown of specifically the film projects that you're working on. What led you to this subject matter, and what specifically does your respective projects concern? So we'll begin with Gina, and we'll move on to Heather.
Certainly. My project came out of my own personal trauma and my own process of getting pregnant and giving birth to my son. I had a lot of angst about potentially having another child, and I knew that the fear was rooted in my experiences. And while doing research on just how to take care of myself and potentially in the process of even having another child, I realized, I found out that, Black women are at a higher rate. And so that fear wasn't out of nothing. It was actually out of evidence of what is happening to Black birthing people in America. And it was actually rooted in history. So when I started to just sort of working through all of this for myself, I realized I needed to put this somewhere, and I wanted to put it out into the world. And that's where Reckoning sort of came about. At first, the idea was just like, okay, I'll just do a short doc on it. And then as I started doing my research, I'm not a researcher by trade. So the more I learned, the more I realized it's more than just, finding the right doctor. It's more than just going to the hospital. It's more than just even the process of knowing your own body. It's rooted in the history of white supremacy and a history of patriarchy in this country. And all the issues that we have are a direct lineage of that history. So, and so then it grew into this 4-part series. And each episode is delving into the history, but also using my life and my journey as the anchor in that. So hopefully people will sort of understand where I'm coming from and sort of get to the root of the issue and what we can all do to help support birthing people in general in this country.
And Heather?
Yes, so the idea for Infamous Characters and Notorious Villains came about. So growing up, my grandmother, my mother's mother, she was darker complected. We were always told we had indigenous ancestry. My grandmother herself, as well as my mother and her siblings, they had underwent discrimination because of the color of their skin. And we always knew that there was something, but we never, even though we were told it was indigenous, it was Cherokee, we always just kind of wondered, if there was something more. And a few years ago, I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago, we started doing the DNA testing. Myself, my brothers, my other family members. And of course, the DNA started showing, more than just European and Indigenous. It also showed African, Middle Eastern, Jewish, Southeast Asian, like all these different, their ethnicities coming up in several family members' DNA results. And that's when we for sure knew that there was definitely something more to the story than just Cherokee. So I started doing research and I found out about a multi-ethnic group of people that were called the Melungeons. And they had settled in parts of Appalachia, in northeastern Tennessee, southeastern Kentucky, western parts of Virginia, and North Carolina. And we did know that so much of our family were from those areas. And then I found there's, certain surnames that are connected to the Melungeon people, which in my family, I have several surnames connected. And we began to realize that our Melungeon roots ran very deep. And that is what inspired us, myself and my two brothers, Andrew Gillen and Jacob Gillen. We decided they were already filmmakers. They had been involved in filming, and then they brought me on when discovering this unique ancestry of ours. And we decided, it'd be great to do a documentary on this because it is such a little known history in America about the intersections of Europeans, Africans, and Indigenous peoples, during colonial America in that beginning. And we really don't hear or are taught a lot about it. So we wanted to delve deeper, not just of course in that history, but of course our own ancestry and finding out the truth about it. So that's what inspired our documentary.
So I was really interested in some of these ideas, like why, I'm personally interested in these concepts, because, talking about where, our origin lies, also things that have been perpetrated against minority people throughout this country's history. But, from the general public perspective, and that's where I always find like my difficulty kind of figuring things out was like, how do you get people who aren't researchers or who aren't filmmakers or people who aren't academics and just, the average person to get interested in these topics? And, I guess like with you, Gina, I think part of what you're doing is definitely, correlated to people's everyday experience. But even then you kind of tie in this historical aspect that people tend to avoid or overlook, And I think with ethnicity, they're like the same things. Like you have this idea of, a personal ethnic identity and family history. Everybody has like the one family member that does all the historical research, but generally speaking, everybody else just kind of, goes along with their everyday life. So how do you get people to care about these subjects, and why should they care about these subjects? And you guys can, whoever wants to take that one.
Well, I think for me, it's life or death and that's pretty extreme. I'm definitely on the further end of the spectrum of why you should care. But I think it's also about it's just self-awareness. We all want to strive to be better, do better. And the only way we can do that is by reconciling our history. And as a person who's dealt with trauma, the other side of that coin is the fact that, when you're dealing with trauma and you're addressing trauma, you have to say it out loud. You have to admit it. You have to tell your story. You have to present it. And that's the only way you can move past the trauma. I feel Black people in particular in this country, but even Indigenous people in this country, we are dealing with generational trauma, and it is affecting us physically, it is affecting us mentally, it is affecting us in where we live. So in order to address the trauma, you have to say it out loud. You have to say, this is why we are having these issues. And it's scary and it hurts, but in order to get to the joy, you have to push past the pain. So that's my take on it.
So for me, Stephen, it was more, so when I became the president of the Melungeon Heritage Association, so often we receive emails from someone who's like myself and my family, just learning about this, this group of multi-ethnic people and being like, you know what, I think I have ancestors, I think we're related. And, you know, what I discovered is, you know, it's really getting it out there and then getting people to start to realize that, oh, you know, I may be connected to these people, and getting them to want to know more and learn more. And I'll tell you, when we started this documentary, when we started filming and we started interviewing, you know, all different people who have this ancestry, this multi-ethnic ancestry, and it didn't matter, you know, it's like, it didn't matter skin tone, it didn't matter, you know, whatever. We all had these similar stories. You know, I was telling you, like, mine was like, you know, Cherokee, and, you know, and you started hearing these same stories from all, you know, from all these people we were interviewing. And I hear them when we get, you know, from people who contact the organization. And we started realizing just how interconnected that we all really are. And I think, for me, I think it's about, you know, to get people to learn this history, this little known history, and to understand the, you know, beginnings of it, is just reaching out and getting people to know that we're all interconnected. Like, this is all of our history. Like, we all need to know this. This is important. So that's kind of, you know, how it shaped up for me.
And so, you know, because I always kind of, like, that was always been my kind of struggle, was like, you know, you try to find ways to relate back to people, you know, what your interest is, like, because there's always like this one thing that kind of sparks it off for you. And then you kind of want to find like these common threads that link people together in that way, you know. And so I always find like that to be the difficult aspect, you know. It's like, well, yeah, like, sure, you know, this is what my heritage is, or sure, this is what we experience, and, you know, everybody has problems, kind of thing. It's like these other ways of like disconnecting from like the real lived experience of people, and even our own lived experiences. I feel like there's like this innate way that we try to disconnect from, I guess, the trauma of it, and I think in the process of that, people kind of lose, you know, that element of humanity that they need to analyze, you know. And I think it's difficult to kind of be the one to try to spark that in other people. And so I'm always curious as to how other people, you know, approach that.
Well, when it comes to like maternal health, like, the fact of the matter is, like, black birthing people have the worst rates. But the fact of the matter is, giving birth in America for all women is dangerous, you know. And when you start to realize that how people who are considered the marginalized, how they are treated, it does in effect affect the majority as well. A lot of the same concepts continue to come up, and I think that's where, in terms of at least my project, how it becomes connected. The fact is, like, how we treat all people affects all people, and I think that's the common thread that a lot of times that people sort of miss when we talk about marginalized groups or a particular group, is that how you treat one set of people has a cascading effect on all people and all humanity.
You're exactly right, Gina. And I'll comment. This is what I found interesting. So in northeastern Tennessee, where there was a large settlement of Melungeon people in what is today Vardee Valley, Newman's Ridge, which is near Sneedsville, Tennessee. It's in a county, it's called Hancock County. Now today, probably most people in Hancock County are of a lighter complexion, but probably a lot of them have these Melungeon roots, you know, to these people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, non-white people. And still to this day, like Hancock County is one of the poorest counties in Tennessee. You know, and you have to wonder like, why is that? And it's like, and it shows that it's like, look, it all, you're exactly right. It all connects. It all affects all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, because I always think about like, you know, like I did a film project on African American, Native American heritage, and I focus a lot on, you know, Georgia specifically, and like, you know, and you start to notice patterns in terms of like how people settle, and then how people, where people decide to live, where people live later on, you know, like, oh, well, this happened, this particular traumatic event or this particular historical event occurred, and then it forced a lot of people to move over here. And then because of that, you know, districts were drawn in such a way to, you know, kind of reinforce certain habits or certain, you know, certain policies and stuff like that. And so just kind of seeing how a lot of this stuff, you know, is interconnected. And I guess shedding the light to people to show like, well, where does this interconnectivity, how does that relate to me? And how does that come back to what I'm interested in, or what I kind of, you know, will gravitate towards. And I think that's, like I said, I always find that to be the difficult thing from my perspective. I find it very interesting to see how other creatives approach that, especially when it comes to films. You know, you really were trying to grab not just the audience that's already interested in what you're doing, but the audience that wasn't even thinking about what you were doing. And I think there's an art to that, and I think a craft to that in particular. So yeah, I find that to be very, very interesting. So in terms of this film idea, like what is you guys' individual process to approaching a film independently? Because I mean, I think, you know, most people when they hear about films, like they think these large productions and like these, you know, a huge budget and all the great stuff that we would like to have, but you know, what is that process like for you to create an independent film?
For me, it's straight guerrilla style, like a camera and a mic, and that's it. And I've lived, and honestly, like technology with what's happened in the past 2 years with the advance, like improving Zoom and all that, has really made it easier to be an independent filmmaker. It gives me a lot more access, and I can still find ways to create a beautiful piece and not have to worry about traveling, you know, to a whole nother state or a country to get to my subject matter. So that has helped me a lot in terms of creating my work. But I'm literally, like, when you talk about shooting budget, like I have zero budget because I have zero money, and I'm figuring out a way to do it with what I got. And then and because I have to realize what's most important is not necessarily like how beautiful it is and all of the bells and whistles. It is about getting my story done and getting my story heard. And that has sort of like fueled the work that I'm doing. But not money, like right now, like money, no. So I just have, like, if I have zero money, have $0, how do I get this done? And that's really what it's been like for me right now, making this piece. And lucky I live in a time where, you know, tech is making it a lot easier for that to happen.
Yeah.
100% what Gina said. You know, it's, yeah, when you're independent filmmakers, you've got hardly any budget, really. You know, the money is just, it's whatever, you know, like for myself and my brothers, it's mainly, you know, we used, of course, a lot of our own money, but, you know, we certainly have used Zoom for interviews. And definitely, you know, when the pandemic happened, that was, you know, that was about the only way we were going to get some interviews to continue doing something with the film during that time. And we also are very lucky that a lot with particularly what we're doing for our documentary, most of the places, like if any of the locations that we need to go to, they're, fortunately for us, they weren't too far. They're all here in the South, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Virginia. So we were very fortunate in that. So, you know, we would just have to scrape some money together and, you know, so to get to some of these locations, but most of them 6-7 hours maybe. So, you know, we were very fortunate in that. But, you know, but yeah, it's really, it's you doing it really all yourself. My brother Andy, he's doing, now we're in post-production, so he's doing a lot of the editing and sound, and it's just, if you have to really have a passion and really believe in what you're doing, and you can do it, you can get it done.
And so did you ever, I guess, especially with like this pandemic kind of going on, it's like, were there habits or things that you normally would do that, you had to kind of readjust, and now you actually find it works better this way? Or, or is it all just kind of like, this is crazy adjustment, and then when things go back to some resemblance of normal, it'll get back to what we need to do, and like, I'll be in my comfort zone kind of thing?
I think I just made me like think a little more logistically, in terms of like, okay, when I only met with a handful of subjects in person, and they, luckily for me, they were all within the same area, so I was able to corral them all. I had to plan it out a little bit more. Usually you're like, oh, I'm going to meet with one subject, and I'm meeting with you at this time, set up the place, and then whatever, and we can have as long as we want. And I had to be very methodical about the process. I had to plan out the spacing, because we did it in a hybrid model. So also getting spaces, I use my network, people I know, to hook me up. So I was able to get a conference room that was attached to another conference room, and I used that room as my recording hub, where I was sitting and talking via Zoom, and then my subject was in the other room, and we were using my computer and my camera. You just start really like planning a little bit more like about the whole process and how long you have, and you take more time with things like it's planning, setting up how much time before, it's how much time after. People got to be masked. Do I have enough masks? Like it's like, but it's an additional logistic piece that you wouldn't have to worry about pre-pandemic. But it's making you think about all those little steps that I probably wouldn't have thought about before. I was taken for granted, and I would say, oh, I have plenty of time to see 3 different subjects in the same area. I can go one day for this one, and instead I had to concise it all into one day and chop them up. But I was able to get 3 interviews done in a single day, as opposed to 1 interview a day. So it just makes your brain think differently. But when you think about money wise, it saved in terms of time and money. Instead of making 3 trips, I took 1 trip. So it's just you start to think differently and work differently.
Yes, you have to be more creative. Yeah, it definitely. I mean, I'll be honest. When the pandemic started, and we'd already set up all these, we had set up some interviews, and of course, when the pandemic started, we had to cancel all those interviews. And at first, I never even thought about doing a Zoom interview. That never occurred. Until as it went along, we're like, oh, we can do Zoom interviews. We don't have to be there. With our interviewees, we can do this by Zoom. And you're right, it really, you have to start thinking outside the box, to when you don't have access to to the people that you need to interview, but also to the the equipment, or you really have to be a lot more open-minded and flexible and creative.
And I think honestly, I was able to also find we created this remote kit. We went to one of our interviewees' house, and I created I got a little cart, and I have my laptop, and I had the camera, and I had it all rigged, and then literally just rolled it in their house, and then we rolled back out, and I did the interview in the car. But that has definitely opened up the options for me, to do more independent films, because now I don't have to be beholden to getting this money to go do interviews. And then we're now in the process of creating a kit that we can literally mail to our subjects, so that way we can get even better quality. And then we ship it, they literally turn it on, plug it in, and then we help them adjust their scenario, and then we can record it. And that had, like I said, now I can interview anyone in the world. Whereas before I would have to I'm going to fly, take care of my kid while I go fly out somewhere. That's, logistically, that was almost an impossibility. Well, now I have all these options now, and it's tolerable price-wise for me. So yes, more creative, but now I'm like, I feel like now I have even more options. I don't feel as trapped as before in terms of getting the kind of projects I want to get done.
And I wondered, like, I always kind of was curious, like, especially after the first, I guess, year of the pandemic and stuff, where really after like the first few months of it, how people will get fatigued by this new way of consuming content. And, you know, because it's like, well, at this point, like all of our entertainment is through streaming platforms and through, you know, online video or screens and things like that. And there's fewer live events happening that incorporated, you know, especially at the very top of the pandemic, very few live events, if any. And it's like, well, people get fatigued by this, and will this kind of approach, you know, will either the aesthetic change, or will people start to kind of get tired of it and want to have, you know, what they're familiar with? And so I'm curious, like, do you think there's a change in that kind of way, or do you think people are coming back to something, or there's, you know,
I think they're both going to live in the same world. It all depends on the individual. Like I love streaming. I also love going to the movies, you know, so I feel like I can do both. And we have, you know, younger people coming. I'm like, don't want to age myself, but having access to all this technology is second nature to the generation coming after me. So I can only imagine like there being more comfortability with doing these things in this manner. I think a report just came out recently about people preferring to work from home as to go into an office every day. So I think it's going to be like a hybrid model. We're going to see a mix of everything. And what you like to do is what you're going to have access to, and what you know, and that's what you're going to be comfortable with. But I think both can exist at the same time. I think it's an amazing time to be an independent filmmaker or creator because you have access to so much. Like if you're really just worried about getting your story out there, if you're really just worried about getting what you need to share, like you have the ability to do that. The only issue is now, because there's so much, how do you get above the noise?
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. It'll certainly be a hybrid model. You know, I too still like, I love the stream, but I do like to go out to the movies. You know, people still are going to want to get together and see one another, or, you know, or do something like as a group, like going to the movies, you know, being with other people and, you know, but the online, you know, technology, through technology and social media and all these, you know, platforms have really been able to, you know, expand, you know, what filmmakers can do. And it also creates this, you know, I feel that it's, you know, it's, I don't want to say easier, but it does, it makes it easier. You know, so, you know, there's so much more you can do. You know, you're not just, you know, you don't have to be like, oh, I've got to make sure we've got to figure out how to get this film into the theater. You know, it's like, no, this documentary can, you know, it may never go to the theater, but it doesn't matter. Like if you can get it streaming on somewhere, you know, it's gonna get you out there, you know. So there's just, it has opened up so many more opportunities. But I agree. But I think I think it'll still be both.
Yeah.
Well, pivoting from, I guess, the more technical stuff to back to like the research interest. Heather, like specifically, because I know a lot of people, like even as you're saying, people in your own family weren't very familiar with, you know, Melungeon heritage and history. And so, you know, for people who may be less familiar, what is like the African American story of the Melungeon people? Because you know, you hear about it, but it's like at the same time, like, what is that? How does that actually connect to African American people?
Oh yeah. So I mean, really you know, these multi-ethnic group of people, you know, they were described as they called them triracial, European, African, and indigenous is what they were. You know, I like to say multi-ethnic. And these basically the term Melungeon, actually, they believe it comes from the French term, which is mélange, which simply means mixed. And that's why, at first these multi-ethnic peoples were called probably some sort of like melange or Melungeon, like a French, and then eventually it anglicized and became Melungeon. But as the term Melungeon, it was actually put upon them. They never called themselves Melungeon, and the term was actually a racial slur. It was used to degrade, and I actually an individual who we interviewed for the documentary, he was born and raised in Verde Valley, grew up in Verde Valley. If you're from that northeastern Tennessee or like Hancock County, a lot of the people, they knew, like if you said I'm from Verde Valley, they knew you were multi-ethnic. They knew you had European, African, and indigenous, and you were discriminated against. And and sometimes even whether or not you were of a lighter, whether or not even if you were lighter complected. I know one woman we interviewed who was from that area, and she was lighter complected, and she said while she was there, like when people knew she was from Verde locally, she was still like looked down upon, discriminated against. It wasn't until she moved out, like when she went to college, that that people were like, oh, she's just white, because they didn't know her heritage. But one gentleman who we interviewed, he said that when he went to school, he was, always discriminated against, and he was called a Melungeon N-word. So Melungeon had that same connotation as the N-word, so they were certainly discriminated against because of the color of their skin. And it really, through my research with the documentary and also through the Melungeon Heritage Association, we're, learning more and more about, those earlier periods in colonial America, in the early 1700s, of the intersections between Europeans, Africans, and indigenous peoples that wound up forming these multi-ethnic groups that, really it begins in that Virginia, North Carolina, and you begin to see how they migrate and they stay in these family groups. That's why you have a lot of the same common surnames, and they migrate out to Appalachia because, they chose the Appalachian Mountains because they were isolated, and it was a place where they can get away from the racist system. So there's the Melungeon people's story is very much wrapped up with the African American story. They were non-white people, they were Black, indigenous people of color, and they were discriminated against because of that, and they settled in places where they can get away from it and be left alone. So it's and I think also that's why we don't know. I never even heard of the term Melungeon until I started learning about this history, and about my own ancestry, and I think that's also why it's not taught in schools.
And so in terms of like the pejorative kind of way of looking at, like, it was kind of like a slur, right? So I guess now, is there kind of like a reclamation of that term that you guys are kind of utilizing at with the Melungeon Heritage Association, or is there kind of like a different attitude towards the term?
Yes, certainly over the years, I would say so in the late 1960s, there was a outdoor drama that was produced. I think it started 1969, I think, to like 1975. And the outdoor drama was it was about the Melungeon people, and it was called Walking Towards the Sunset. And this was really a beginning. The drama brought people in and started telling the story about these people, and people who knew themselves to be their descendants, and Melungeon, it brought more of them out and talking more about it. And, so you begin to see the beginning of them coming more to terms with the term Melungeon. And when it was in the mid 1990s, I believe, a book by a gentleman named Brent Kennedy came out called The Melungeons, The Resurrection of a Proud People. And actually Kennedy, it was through this book that they founded the Melungeon Heritage Association, the organization, I believe in like 1997. So yeah, so it really is, they began to be like, okay, we're going to take this term back, and we're going to embrace it, and we're going to learn more about our ancestors and find that truth.
And conversely, Gina, how does your project kind of talk about some of the non-white but non-Black aspects of reproductive health and justice?
It's more or less like, it's not just reproductive, but also like just the medical industry in itself. Mm-hmm. I think that even the way Americans in general look at doctors and sort of look at them as the authority figures, and how that is even come to about, because it wasn't that way in this country. How do you go from being seen as a barber, literally, which is an illegitimate job, snake oil salesman, to now being the authority when people make decisions about their medical health, like their health. How does that transition happen? And that in RPs, it covers that process. And that's not specific to any specific group. That is an American story. So it's just the process in which, like, they literally went through what you would call like a PR terminology. They went through courts. They used legal actions and to create authority and take authority. And now doctors have it, and not necessarily say that they shouldn't, but in that process, we as the people have essentially also lost our voice, and we've sort of taken it and given it to this authority, which is very much a patriarchal process, right? There is a hierarchy, an organization, a group of people who deserve to have the power and tell us what is right for us. We see sort of that behavior more frequently in marginalized communities, but it is a very much an American aspect. So that's really like how I've been looking at just the history of medicine in America, and also the idea of like ethics in medicine. Consent is a huge concept in the project that I do, and what does it mean to give consent, and who has the right to give consent, and in which manners that is given. Also, and self-advocacy and where that has come about. And like that's like, once again, that's also a very American thing to have to think about, is advocating for yourself when you're having health issues, having to like the fact that you have to advocate for yourself in an industry that's first response is do no harm. But having the knowledge and the wherewithal to know that you can advocate for yourself, and that is a partnership. So I think that would be sort of like more of the cusp of what is the American grain in what I'm working on.
It's really interesting because even with that, like, there's a parallel, like this idea of, genealogical research and like looking up, ethnic origins and things of that nature. One of the things that I always came across, like with doing some of the research I've been doing, that, when they say like Native American DNA, for instance, isn't, so you have like these reference samples, and they're based off of, well, how many individuals who consider themselves of this particular ethnic group, or largely agreed upon being a part of this particular ethnic group, have been tested and are now the reference for everyone else who may have the same heritage. So you find the most genetically pure member of a particular group or set of members of a particular group, you test them, they become kind of like the baseline of what this group is on a genetic level. I'm putting this in layman terms just so no scientists come out and fry me or anything, but So then afterwards, when you take a DNA test, for instance, try to find your ethnicity, it's compared off of this particular group that's defined. A lot of Native American groups do not participate in this and have not participated in this. And for multiple reasons, there isn't a way to say, well, this is a pure Cherokee genetic DNA marker, and things of that nature. But a lot of it stems from the unethical practices of the medical industry and the academic industries, and in terms of research, and how people have been mistreated by this, by this community, essentially, this academic medical community. And and I can't help but kind of see that tie-in when people are like, well, I'm researching my ancestry, I'm researching my heritage in this kind of way, I'm conducting long-form research, but then at the same time, you have to rely on some of these systems and programs that may have mistreated them to kind of define that. And there may be even a rejection of that because of it. A DNA test doesn't prove who I am. And, I think that in itself is very interesting to me. I find that to really speak to kind of both of you guys' research angles, like you guys are coming from this from two different ends, but, I'm sure we all have relatives who refuse to go to a doctor. And, there's a correlation there. I'm very interested in kind of unpacking what that really is.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of what I've found is that it's not coming from nowhere. It's historic. And when you think about specifically like the African American culture, we've historically relied heavily on storytelling as the means of sharing our experiences. And because we're left out of history, we're left out of the stories that are told by the other, we're left out of the books, we're left out of textbooks. So how do we relay history? We relay history orally. We share it down, we pass it down. And sometimes that's helpful, because anecdotal evidence is always helpful, but sometimes it is also detrimental to our own health. I think when it comes to health, in particular for Black people, I think we need to look at it more of as a partnership, right? We can't give full authority to the doctor, but we need to be a partner in it. And the doctor can't take authority from us. So we have to look at it together. The other part from especially when you're talking about especially the DNA piece, that you looking at a group that was unethically, child together, and that's how the information was gathered. There's the other piece is bias, and I like to believe that most doctors and most medical professionals and most scientists have the global population's best interests at heart. But if they're not aware of their own biases, even when they're doing these studies, they can leave out whole groups of people that are significant and that ultimately can help, the wider population. We see it all the time. Like a lot of studies for pharmaceuticals, they're done mostly on white men, but they're not the majority of the population. When you add, and then you give heart medicine, or the standards for determining whether or not a person has a heart attack, those are done based off of information gathered from one section of society. So then when a woman or a Black woman or a person of multiracial background comes in presenting with something different, you can't see it because what you've been taught has been influenced by the biases already in the system. The other issue is using that same bias to then deal with calculations of medication, and then there's literally no scientific basis for it. It's all anecdotal, but for that reason, they decide, well, we're going to add in the factor that this person is Black or presents as Black. And now in this calculation for their, and specifically with reproductive medicine, whether or not this woman can give birth vaginally after having a cesarean, well, her race is included in the calculation. There's no scientific evidence that has to do with the physicality of why that woman can't give birth vaginally after a cesarean, other than the medical bias that has been implicit that causes Black women to have the cesareans at a higher rate than the rest of the population. So they continue to reiterate the same biases, and that ends up causing a detriment to everyone. So now it's a detriment to even the person providing the service. They think they're doing what's in the best interest of their patient, and they're actually harming their patient, which they don't want to do. But we have to admit that there is a problem in order to address the problem.
So
That's like a long story short.
Real quick, Stephen, and Gina, so, you know, this is interesting. I totally, you know, when we have this, you're exactly right. When you have this, just this ideology of medicine through, you know, white and usually male, you know, mindset, you know, viewpoint, you're right. Like one of the, I want to say just real quick, you know, I mentioned Brent Kennedy, who had wrote the book on the Melungeon people. And what actually got him to learn about his Melungeon ancestry, his multi-ethnic ancestry, he was diagnosed with a very rare disease that normally it doesn't, of course, pop up in a European or like, you know, white person's, you know, genetic makeup, but it was a Middle Eastern. It was a Middle Eastern. It popped up in Middle Eastern populations, and that's what he was like. Well, wait a minute, what? Like, how do I have this disease then? Like how, you know, and it's very rare, but it's genetic. And so, you know, when you go, and then my own grandmother, she had a rare blood disease that we found has a Jewish genetic connection. And so, and then having talked to others, you know, you being, you know, like, once again, if you're just looking, you know, if you don't know about this, your multi-ethnic, you know, ancestry, and you're just like, I'm white, or, you know, I'm European, you know, you're totally, you know, and the medical establishment doesn't take any of that into consideration. And then you start having people who are lighter complected, but then they're, you know, they, like Brent Kennedy, they get diagnosed with a disease that they're like, wait a minute, what? And then you have no idea, like, you know, had no idea that he had this multi-ethnic, you know, ancestry, and, you know, and then it got him into learning about it. But you're right. It's, you know, it does, once again, it does affect all of us, you know, and
well,
that's why.
And if you think about it, that if he presents as white, a lot of doctors wouldn't even consider it as for their diagnosis, because why would he have that genetic disorder? Because it only presents in this ethnic group. So I'm not going to test for it. So like ultimately, like, all right, like implicit bias affects everyone. It affects everyone.
Yep.
Yeah, and it also kind of reminds me of even on the genealogical, like just research end of things, like documentation wise, you know, who presents as what, and then that's what they're recorded as, and then eventually it turns into a community is this, because this is what they are recorded as according to this written criteria based off of arbitrary decisions. And so like select group of people say, well, this is what white is, and therefore we go out to this community, and now this community is white. And I'm, you know, and I'm thinking about, like, you know, particularly the Melungeon people probably fall, if I'm guessing correctly, probably fell within every, you know, census spectrum that you could possibly imagine.
Yes.
You know, throughout time, you know, and
Yeah.
so they probably were listed as multiple things at different times,
Yeah.
depending on who was doing it.
Yep.
I think it really comes down to like it's a comfortability thing, right? It would make life so much easier if everyone fit into this box and this box, and like it makes life easier when you can just group things as opposed to just delving deeper into the individual. And that's one of the big things, especially when it comes to medicine. Like it needs to be individualized. You use this data. Yes, the data is important in terms of helping to help solve problems, because you need that information, but you have to set aside the data sometimes and look at the individual, and then just start going through the different possibilities. But it's hard to tell people, okay, yes, it's a huge concept, right? Like gender, race, ethnicity, culture, like all of these things, it's a lot, and it's scary. But until you realize that, you know, like, let's not focus on it so much and focus a little bit further on the individual, then you can get that information that you need to provide the proper diagnosis. But changing that thought pattern is difficult. And we see it every day. We see, especially when you're talking about gender and sex, and like we see every day the idea that everyone is not either male or female, everyone is not either gay or straight. You know, it's like that concept is hard for people to rectify with. And it's going to take time, but with stories like the Melungeons and stories like we have to keep telling these stories and keep putting them out there and keep sharing and keep having our stories heard in order for people to get around to the fact that they feel comfortable with the change. You know, and I think that's probably like one of the biggest things that I've learned in my own process is like, I don't want people to feel bad because they benefited from a system that has harmed other people. Like, yes, you should feel something. They're humans, right? But ultimately, the process should be to what can we do about it? What can we change? And how can we make life better for everyone? It's scary, you know, and I think we have to first admit that on a human level for everyone, change is scary. The norm, like sometimes knowing things that are always going to be this way and that way, we've seen it in the past 2 years, right? I knew that I could walk out the door and not have to wear a mask and go, you know, I felt that, like I felt that comfortability. And then when it was taken away, it's scary. It's still scary, you know, and then we have to understand that there are people who are on the end that they're scared and this scares them. Change scares them. So how else do we get them ready? We tell them stories to make them understand why the change is necessary.
And so with that, when you guys were working on your own process of creating your films, what interviews or findings did you find the most interesting? You know, and what were the most resonating for you? You know, it could have been something that you, just a particular individual, or, you know, something that you learned, information that you came across that resonated with you in particular. And I guess we're going Heather and then Gina, and then we'll close out with a couple questions from the audience.
Sure. Mine really was just how learning about how interconnected so many of us really are, especially with that earlier colonial American history, with the intersections of Africans, Europeans, and Indigenous peoples. It really, like I said, I myself is actually, I'm a historian. You know, I studied history in school and I never really came upon anything like it. And it really, you know, it really opened my eyes. I mean, I was like, wow, you know, and then to be connected to them, these are my ancestors, and realizing that their stories need to be told. And like what you had mentioned, Stephen, and going on what Gina was talking about, like they were a multi-ethnic people, and nobody could, you're right, the census takers would come in and you can have various different skin tones and, you know, everything, you know, in just one household, and you'd have each person a different ethnicity or a different, you know, and, you know, you're right, it was all across the board. I mean, even my own grandmother, like her family, like there were 7 siblings, and each one, they all were different skin tones and different, you know, and it's like, you can't label that, you know, you can't. And, you know, they were always described as being too white to be black, too black to be white. You know, they always fell in this ambiguous region, you know, this ambiguous dome, and you can't label it though. And I think, you know, I feel that their history and their stories are so important to America right now, especially. You know, you have, you know, Gina was talking about, you have a lot of people, they're afraid of the present and they're afraid of the future. They're afraid of a diverse future. But the thing is like, no, we had a diverse past. You know, that's what the Melungeon people and others like them represent. You know, we come from a diverse past, so we don't need to be afraid of a diverse future. And so I really, you know, that was what really, you know, and that we're all interconnected. You know, we definitely, I think, need a new narrative for it, you know, within our American narrative. We need a new one that can bring together, you know, all people. So, you know, that was what really got my attention, and really, and I just learned a lot from, since doing this research and filming this documentary.
Gina?
I mean, I had the opportunity to interview a lot of amazing women in this project. And like I say, women, like Black women, when it comes to maternal health, they are the driving force behind the rectification of, of what's happening to us. But one in particular, her name is Dr. Alicia Bonaparte. She's a professor sociology, and one of the lines that she said, I put it in my trailer, and it was because it continues to resonate with me. And she said, history is our teacher. And we have, like, whenever there's an issue, like I was like, okay, well, how did people look at this in the past? And that it's our guiding force, and we can't be afraid of it. We have to just look at it and see what we can gather from it. And one of the things she did mention was it's just the sisterhood that, especially the midwives, which we delve into, the sisterhood that they create, the community that they created in the birthing process. And I was so moved by it in the sense that they created this cocoon for Black women to give birth. And it wasn't just Black women, because the midwives, especially in before the turn of the century, before doctors became a thing, they birthed all of the babies. So Black and white babies were coming into this cocoon of love, and the mother was there surrounded by people that love them. They did this whole process of cleaning and doing their hair, and it was just a beautiful process. And I would love for us to be able to have that community again. And we're seeing the work being done in smaller communities and in small subsects. But the process of bringing a child into the world should not be a traumatic event for the mother or the child. It should be a loving, receiving event. And her telling me about this history, and then once again, she told it to me earlier. I did not read this anywhere else. She told it to me. I think we need to, for me, having these different ways to sort of share history. It doesn't always have to come in a book written by, some old dead white guy. It's the stories that we tell each other and that we share. That is history. And finding the finding that and finding value in that has been probably the most profound event that has happened to me while working on this project.
And we did have one question in terms of how can we access these projects, and also how can we support?
Who jump in? So I'll go. Reckoningdoc.com is my website for my project. We were slated to premiere in January, but we're pushing our date into now May of 2022. We're still looking out to where I want it to live right now. It's probably going to be on the website. You can find out how to support our project, also support organizations that are doing the work to support Black birthing people in general in this country. Some amazing organizations. Yeah, that's it.
Our website I'll give you so for Underbyte Films, it's www.underbyte, and it's UNDERBYTE films.com, and you can follow. We're also on Facebook, Instagram. Also, if you want to learn more about the Melungeon Heritage Association, you can find it at www.melungeon, and that's MELUNGEON.org is where you can find out about the Melungeon organization and learn more. And Melungeon Heritage Association is also on Facebook as well. So you just type in Melungeon Heritage Association and it should come up. Yeah, that's
okay. And again, thank you. Unless you guys have something else to add, we're going to wrap it up. And but I would like to say thank you again to both our guests today. Again, we try to have these things be more of conversational. Still working out how to facilitate that, especially in a virtual environment. This an open-ended kind of discussion thing. But definitely thank you for helping kick off the 4th Dividing Lines Symposium. Again, we appreciate both Heather Andolina and Gina Faulkner for coming through. And yeah, please support their projects and their work. Both of these are very talented women doing some amazing research, amazing work. So please continue to support. And as always, please support the Art Center. You can visit www.artcenter.org and go to the donate page. Also, you can contribute just by sharing these videos and kind of posting, reposting, things like that, just kind of getting the awareness of our organization out there a little bit more. Next week, we will be returning with, at 1 p.m., Miss Arlene Walker discussing her book, as well as entitled Seeds of Deception. And then 7 p.m. on the 26th, we'll be meeting with Kimberly Knight and Frederick Murphy, discussing their upcoming film Duality, discussing the African-American, Native American narrative and experience. And so that will be wrapping up our Dividing Lines Symposium. So please join us next week. We'll be posting all week through our social media platforms at Art Center. And thank you very much again to our guests. And hope to see you there next week.